I was standing on the rooftop terrace of the Vanguard Hotel, holding the first ultrasound picture I had ever been brave enough to show anyone, when my mother-in-law shattered a crystal flute of champagne at my feet and told me my unborn baby was nothing but a $6 million scam. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The champagne spread across the Italian marble like liquid gold, glass glittering around my heels while Atlanta glowed behind the terrace walls, as if this were still supposed to be a beautiful family dinner. I had imagined this night differently. I had imagined Terrence squeezing my hand, Vivian crying dignified tears, Jamal making some awkward joke, Chloe pretending to be happy even if she hated me. I had imagined the family finally softening after 5 long years of miscarriages, treatments, whispers, and pity disguised as concern. Instead, Vivian stood at the head of the table in pearls and champagne silk, breathing hard, her perfect society mask twisted into something raw and ugly. "You really thought you could strap on a silicone bump and walk into my family fortune?" she hissed. My hands tightened around the sonogram. "I am 8 weeks pregnant," I said, forcing every word out clearly because I knew if my voice shook, they would use it against me. "Call the clinic." The number is printed on the report. Chloe Sinclair Vaughn, my brother-in-law's wife and Vivian's favorite example of proper breeding, leaned back with her martini and smiled like she had been waiting all night for this moment. "Anyone can buy a fake sonogram online, Jada. Honestly, for a forensic accountant, I expected cleaner paperwork." Jamal laughed under his breath and adjusted the expensive watch he loved showing off, even though everyone knew his position in the Vanguard company existed mostly because Vivian protected him. "She reviews trusts for a living," he said. "You think she didn't know the deadline was coming?" That word hit me harder than the broken glass near my feet. Deadline. I turned toward Terrence, my husband of 10 years, the man who had held me in hospital rooms after 3 miscarriages, the man who had cried with me that morning when I called him from the clinic parking lot and whispered, "The baby has a heartbeat." He should have been on his feet. He should have been furious. He should have taken that sonogram from my shaking hand and shown every person at that table what we had fought for. Instead, he looked from me to his mother, swallowed hard, and said nothing. Vivian saw his silence and stepped into it like a queen entering a courtroom. "Your grandfather was very clear, Terrence," she said, never taking her eyes off me. "The $6 million trust unlocks only when you produce a verified biological heir before your 36th birthday. And now, 7 months before that birthday, after 5 barren years, this woman suddenly arrives with a miracle." My chest went cold. Terrence had told me his grandfather left complicated estate documents, but he had always described them as background noise, nothing that mattered to our marriage. Now I understood why the entire table had looked prepared before I even sat down. My pregnancy was not family news to them, it was a financial threat. "If Terrence has no child before 36, Jamal said, smiling wider, "the trust defaults to the secondary beneficiary." He tapped his own chest. Me. The truth settled over the table like smoke. They were not confused. They were not worried. They were angry because my baby stood between Jamal and $6 million. I placed the ultrasound on the white linen table and slid it toward Terrence. "Look at it," I said. "That is your child." He stared at the small gray image, but his face did not soften. Vivian lowered her voice. "Terrence, remember what the specialist said about hormone treatments. Remember how emotional she became last week." I turned slowly toward him. "Do not do this." He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes dropping away from mine. "Jada, maybe we should verify everything privately before this gets worse." The words landed like a slap. "Worse than your mother calling our baby a fraud?" He flinched, but he still did not defend me. Chloe set down her martini with a delicate click. "There are psychiatric doctors who handle women who become attached to imagined pregnancies." For a moment, all I could hear was the soft jazz playing from the terrace speakers, elegant and ridiculous, floating above the wreckage of my marriage. I looked at Vivian's satisfaction, Jamal's greed, Chloe's polished cruelty, and Terrence's cowardice, and something inside me became very still. I had spent 10 years trying to be patient with this family, 10 years laughing softly at insults, swallowing corrections about my background, pretending not to hear Vivian call me ambitious, like it was a disease. I had done it because I loved Terrence. I had done it because I believed marriage meant choosing peace sometimes. But peace built on silence is just surrender wearing a nicer dress. I picked up the sonogram and put it back into my clutch. I am leaving, I said. Terrence finally reached for my wrist. Jada, wait. I pulled away. No. You waited. You waited while they called me barren. You waited while they called our child fake. You waited because choosing me would cost you something. His face broke for half a second, but not enough to matter. Vivian stood so quickly her chair scraped against the marble. You do not walk out of here with my family's wealth. I looked at her across the shattered champagne. Watch me. I turned toward the sweeping marble staircase that led from the private rooftop terrace down to the hotel lobby. Behind me, the table erupted in low voices, but I kept walking. I had taken only a few steps when I heard Vivian's heels striking the floor behind me, fast and sharp. Terrence said, Mom. But his voice was weak, already too late. Her hand clamped onto my shoulder, fingers digging into the fabric of my dress. You think a girl from Southside Atlanta gets to steal a legacy because she learned how to read bank statements? She snapped. I turned just enough to push her hand away. Take your hand off me. Her eyes dropped to my stomach, still flat beneath the silk, and something panicked flashed across her face. Not disbelief, fear. That was when I understood the accusation had never been about truth. It was about control. If they admitted this baby was real, the money moved. If the money moved, whatever they were hiding could move with it. I did not know yet what secret sat beneath the trust, but I knew numbers, and I knew fear when I saw it. There is no baby, Vivian whispered, almost to herself. Then louder, for everyone behind us to hear, there is no baby. I stepped back toward the stairs, one hand moving instinctively to protect my stomach. You are sick. Her face changed. The polished matriarch vanished. What remained was pure survival dressed in pearls. No, she said. I am protecting my family. Then she shoved me. It was not an accident. It was not confusion. It was not an old woman losing balance. Both of her hands slammed into my chest with enough force to knock the breath out of me. My heels slid across the champagne she had thrown, and the world tipped backward. I reached for the brass railing, but my fingers only scraped cold metal. Terrence screamed my name. Jamal cursed. Chloe gasped like the sound was part horror, part opportunity. Then the first marble step struck my ribs and pain exploded white-hot through my body. I folded both arms around my stomach as I fell, trying to shield the tiny heartbeat they wanted erased before it ever became a name. Step after step tore the air from my lungs. The skyline spun above me, all glass, lights, and witnesses who had waited too long to act. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Vivian standing at the top of the staircase, staring down at me with one hand still lifted, not sorry, not shocked, only terrified that I might survive long enough to prove her wrong. Pain reached me before consciousness did. It felt as if someone had driven a steel bar through my ribs and left it there. Every breath burned. Every movement hurt. For several seconds I kept my eyes closed, trying to understand whether I was alive or trapped inside a nightmare. Then I heard the steady beeping of a heart monitor and smelled antiseptic. Hospital. The memory slammed back into me all at once. The rooftop terrace. The shattered champagne glass. Vivian's hands. The stairs. My eyes flew open. Bright white lights blurred above me. Panic exploded through my chest so violently that I almost ripped the IV from my arm. My hands immediately moved to my stomach. Nothing else mattered. Not the pain. Not the hospital room. Not the fact that every part of my body felt broken. Only one question mattered. My baby. My voice came out as a cracked whisper. Where's my baby? A familiar face appeared beside the bed. Dr. Jada Reynolds. My best friend since college. The woman who had been beside me through every miscarriage, every fertility treatment, every moment I thought motherhood might never happen for me. Relief flashed across her face when she saw I was awake. She immediately grabbed my hand. Easy. Don't move. Kesha. My throat tightened. The baby. For a moment she said nothing. The pause nearly stopped my heart. Then she squeezed my hand harder. Your daughter is still fighting. Tears instantly filled my eyes. Still fighting? She's alive. The words shattered something inside me. I started crying before I even realized it was happening. Not loud sobs, just tears sliding silently down my face. Kesha pulled a chair closer to the bed. You have a severe concussion, 3 fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder. You lost a lot of blood. But somehow your little girl held on. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer I hadn't prayed in years. My daughter was alive. Against every law of probability. Against every nightmare. Against every impact of that staircase. She was alive. How long? I asked. 20 hours. 20 hours. Nearly an entire day gone. Kesha's expression darkened. The police took an initial statement from hotel staff. There were witnesses. Hope flickered briefly. Then they know what happened. Kesha hesitated. That hesitation frightened me more than the injuries. What? I asked. She looked toward the door. Things got complicated. Before I could ask what that meant, the hospital room door swung open. My stomach dropped immediately. Vivian entered first. Jamal followed. Chloe walked in behind them. Terrence came last. None of them looked worried. None of them looked guilty. None of them looked like people who had watched a pregnant woman nearly die. They looked organized, prepared, like a legal team arriving for a meeting. Kesha immediately stood. Visiting hours are restricted. Vivian ignored her completely. Her designer dress had been replaced by a conservative cream-colored suit. She looked every bit the grieving, concerned family matriarch. It was a performance, and she was very good at it. Thank God you're awake, she said softly. I stared at her in disbelief. The woman who had tried to kill me was pretending to care about my recovery. Get out, I said. The smile on her face never moved. Jada, sweetheart, get out. Terrence stepped forward. Baby, please. I turned toward him. Did you tell the police she pushed me? He froze. That was all the answer I needed. Vivian immediately took control of the conversation. Everyone is very concerned about your condition. My condition? I laughed bitterly. You shoved me down a staircase. No. Her tone remained calm. You fell. Jamal crossed his arms. Several people saw you storm away from the table. After being accused of fraud. Because your behavior was concerning, Chloe interrupted smoothly. There it was. The first brick in the wall they were building. I could almost see it forming in real time. They weren't defending themselves. They were creating a new story. A version where I wasn't a victim. A version where I wasn't credible. A version where nothing I said could be trusted. Tell me what story you gave the police, I said. Nobody answered immediately. That told me everything. Finally, Terrence spoke. Mom told them she tried to stop you from falling. I stared at him. And you agreed? He swallowed. Jada, you were emotional. Emotional. Not assaulted. Not attacked. Emotional. Kesha's jaw tightened. That's enough. Vivian ignored her. You have been under tremendous pressure for years. I knew where this was going before she finished the sentence. 3 miscarriages. Fertility treatments. Hormone therapy. Grief. She was building a psychological profile. You became obsessed with having a baby, Vivian continued. Obsessed? My voice rose. I am pregnant. Chloe opened her handbag. About that. My entire body went still. She removed several sheets of paper and handed them to Terrence. What is that? I asked. Chloe sighed dramatically. Information we discovered this morning. Terrence looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Yet he still accepted the papers. My instincts immediately activated. Years of forensic accounting had trained me to recognize manipulation. Documents often lied better than people. Read it, Vivian encouraged. Terrence scanned the first page. His face changed. Not shock, disappointment. That frightened me. What is it? I demanded. Nobody answered. Finally, Chloe spoke. Medical records. I stared at her. What medical records? She folded her hands neatly in her lap. Records indicating that you underwent a sterilization procedure 5 years ago. Silence filled the room. Even Kesha looked stunned. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. That's ridiculous. But nobody else laughed. Terrence kept staring at the papers. It says. He stopped. It says you're unable to conceive. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Those records are fake. Chloe tilted her head sympathetically. That's exactly what someone would say. Suddenly, everything made sense. They weren't trying to prove I wasn't pregnant. They were trying to prove I was delusional. If they could convince enough people that I believed something impossible, then every accusation against them became meaningless. Every witness statement, every claim about the staircase, every future lawsuit, everything. It was actually a smart strategy. Evil, but smart. Who forged those documents? I asked quietly. Chloe smiled. No one forged anything. You expect me to believe that? I expect people to believe evidence. Kesha stepped forward immediately. Those papers are garbage. For the first time, Vivan acknowledged her presence. And you would know? I'm chief of staff. The room became very quiet. Kesha continued. I personally reviewed Jada's records. Chloe's smile faded slightly. Vivan recovered first. Then perhaps an independent psychiatric evaluation would be appropriate. There it was, the real objective. Not defending themselves, not explaining the fall, not discussing the pregnancy. They wanted a psychiatric diagnosis. Something official. Something permanent. Something they could wave around in court later. Terrence looked exhausted, confused, weak. Exactly what Vivan needed him to be. Maybe that's not a bad idea, he said quietly. My heart stopped. Not because I was surprised, because part of me had still hoped, despite everything, despite the dinner, despite the accusations, despite the staircase. Some small, foolish part of me still believed my husband would choose me when it mattered. He didn't. He chose the easier path, the safer path, the path where his mother remained innocent and his life remained comfortable. You think I'm insane? I asked. No, he said quickly. I think you're hurting. Answer the question. He looked away. And that was answer enough. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier than the fractures in my ribs. Finally, Vivan stood. We'll arrange the evaluation. Kesha immediately objected. Over my dead body. But Vivan wasn't looking at her anymore. She was looking at me. And for the first time since entering the room, I saw genuine confidence in her eyes. She believed she was winning. She believed I was trapped. She believed one fall down a staircase had ended the threat I represented. As the family turned toward the door, Terrence hesitated. For one brief moment, our eyes met. I wanted him to say something. Anything. An apology. A defense. A promise. Instead, he followed them out. The door closed behind him. The room became silent again. Kesha looked furious. I looked at the ceiling. My daughter was alive. But everything else had changed. Because the people who should have been terrified of attempted murder weren't acting afraid at all. They were acting like people protecting a much bigger secret. And for the first time since the fall, I stopped asking why Vivan pushed me. I started asking what she was so desperate to hide. The morning after Terrence agreed to let his family question my sanity, I stopped thinking of him as my husband. That realization did not arrive with anger or tears. It arrived with silence. I lay awake in my hospital bed watching sunlight crawl across the ceiling while replaying every conversation we had shared during 10 years of marriage. The memories that once felt comforting now looked different. Every compromise I had made, every insult I had ignored, every time I convinced myself that keeping peace was more important than being respected. Looking back, I could see a pattern I had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Whenever conflict existed between me and his family, Terrence never chose a side. He simply waited for the storm to pass and hoped everyone would forget. The problem was that real life did not work that way. Eventually, refusing to choose became a choice of its own. My daughter almost died because a man spent 10 years avoiding difficult decisions. Around noon, Kesha returned carrying a tablet and a stack of paperwork. She immediately noticed I was different. You haven't cried once today, she said. I looked at her. I'm done grieving. Kesha pulled a chair closer to the bed. That's either very good or very dangerous. Maybe both. She studied me for several seconds before nodding slowly. Good, because you're going to need a clear head. She placed the tablet on my lap. The screen displayed a legal filing. My stomach tightened immediately. What is this? Your mother-in-law works fast. I began reading. The petition had been filed through a private attorney representing Terrence. According to the document, there were concerns regarding my mental stability, my ability to make medical decisions, and my capacity to safely manage my pregnancy. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. He signed this? Kesha nodded. Yesterday evening. The room suddenly felt colder. Less than 24 hours after I nearly died, my husband had signed paperwork supporting a psychiatric review. Not because doctors recommended it, not because evidence existed, because his mother wanted it. The betrayal hurt less than I expected. Maybe because it was no longer surprising. Can they do this? I asked. Request it? Yes. Force it? Not easily. Kesha folded her arms. But that's not the point. She was right. The point was never winning immediately. The point was creating a narrative, a paper trail. Something future lawyers could point to later and say, see? Concerns existed. As a forensic accountant, I had seen the strategy countless times. Fraud rarely started with one giant lie. It started with small lies layered on top of each other until they looked like truth. They are building a case, I said quietly. Exactly. I looked back at the filing. The language was careful, professional, designed to sound compassionate. Every sentence claimed concern, every paragraph painted me as unstable, yet not a single line mentioned that I had been pushed down a staircase. Not one. The omission felt deliberate. Because it was. If the assault became the center of attention, Vivian faced consequences. If my mental state became the center of attention, everyone forgot about the assault. Suddenly, another realization struck me. Where's the police report? Kesha's expression darkened. That's the interesting part. She opened another file on the tablet. 3 witness statements have already changed. I sat upright despite the pain. Changed how? People who originally reported seeing an argument now claim they only heard raised voices. My pulse accelerated. That's impossible. Not if someone starts making phone calls. The answer was obvious. Money, influence, reputation. The same weapons Vivian had used her entire life. I leaned back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't panic anymore. This wasn't family drama. This was damage control. Organized damage control. That realization bothered me more than anything else. Innocent people usually reacted emotionally after a crisis. Guilty people reacted strategically. Vivian was reacting strategically, which meant she wasn't worried about being misunderstood. She was worried about evidence. Something bigger is going on, I said. Kesha didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened another document. I was waiting for you to reach that conclusion yourself. My eyes narrowed. What aren't you telling me? Kesha slid a folder across the bed. Look at the company names. I opened it carefully. Most people would have seen meaningless financial records. I saw patterns. LLCs, holding companies, consulting agreements, transfers, shell entities. My heartbeat accelerated. Where did you get this? One of my patients works in commercial banking. I scanned the first few pages, then the second, then the third. Every page raised more questions. Several companies appeared connected to Vanguard Holdings. Others appeared connected to Jamal personally. A few looked designed specifically to hide ownership. This isn't normal. I know. I flipped another page, then another. Suddenly I froze. A familiar company name appeared. I recognized it from an audit 3 years earlier. At the time, it had triggered a fraud review. The investigation disappeared before completion. Why would this company be connected to Jamal? Kesha leaned forward. You tell me. My mind immediately began assembling possibilities. Money moving through multiple entities, ownership obscured, reporting obligations avoided. None of it proved a crime. Not yet. But it proved something else. Jamal's financial life was far more complicated than the wealthy playboy image he projected publicly. The trust isn't the whole story, I whispered. No. Kesha shook her head. I don't think it is. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. I kept reviewing documents while pieces slowly started falling into place. The trust fund explained motive, but motive alone rarely drove people to attempted murder. $6 million was significant money. Yet something about the panic I saw in Vivian's eyes felt larger than inheritance. Desperation usually meant exposure. Exposure meant secrets. Secrets meant leverage, and leverage meant evidence. Eventually, I closed the folder. I need a divorce attorney. Kesha smiled for the first time all day. Now you're thinking clearly. I also need every financial record connected to Vanguard Holdings. Already requested. And I want copies of every witness statement. Working on it. I looked at her carefully. How long have you been preparing for this conversation? She laughed softly. Since the moment I saw hotel security trying to access your medical records. My expression hardened immediately. They did what? Two men arrived before sunrise claiming to represent family interests. Rage flashed through me. They weren't just attacking my credibility anymore. They were trying to control information. Every hour revealed a deeper layer of planning. Every answer created 3 new questions. Yet strangely, I felt calmer than I had in years. Fear was disappearing. In its place came clarity. Because for the first time, I understood the battlefield. This wasn't about family. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about inheritance. It was about power. And power always left a trail if you followed the money long enough. Kesha stood and gathered the paperwork. Before leaving, she paused near the door. One more thing. What? She reached into her bag and placed a small sealed envelope on the bedside table. This arrived anonymously an hour ago. I frowned. What's inside? I didn't open it. After she left, I stared at the envelope for several seconds. No return address. No name. Nothing except my room number written in black ink. Slowly, I opened it. A single photograph slid into my lap. The image showed Jamal entering a downtown office building late at night. Standing beside him was a man I immediately recognized from a federal fraud investigation years earlier. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 7 words. They weren't a threat. They weren't a warning. They were a direction. Follow the money before they move it. The photograph stayed on my bedside table all night. Every time I woke up, my eyes drifted back to it. Jamal standing beside a man connected to a federal fraud investigation was not evidence of a crime. It was something more dangerous. It was a clue. And clues had a way of multiplying once someone started asking the right questions. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I was finished defending myself. Defending yourself meant reacting to accusations. It meant playing on someone else's field. Vivin wanted me explaining why I wasn't crazy. Jamal wanted me explaining why my pregnancy was real. Terrence wanted me explaining why our marriage deserved saving. I was done explaining. From now on, I would investigate. 3 days later, I was discharged from the hospital. My ribs still hurt every time I breathed too deeply. My shoulder remained heavily strapped. Walking was exhausting, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. Kesha drove me directly to her house instead of my own. "You're not going back there," she said firmly. "Not until we know what we're dealing with." She was right. My home was no longer safe. Every drawer, every computer, every document inside that house was potentially accessible to people who had already proven they would manipulate records and fabricate evidence. The moment we arrived, Kesha led me downstairs to a large finished basement. Several folding tables had been set up against the walls. Whiteboards covered one side of the room. 2 laptops sat open beside stacks of folders. I stopped halfway down the stairs. "What is all this?" Kesha smiled. "Your war room." For the first time since the fall, I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound of someone realizing she wasn't fighting alone. "You did all this?" "Not by myself." She pointed toward the far side of the room. A man stood from behind one of the laptops. He was in his late 50s with gray hair, reading glasses, and the permanently exhausted expression of someone who spent too much time dealing with lawyers. "Jada Reynolds," he said, extending a hand. "Victor Lang." I shook it carefully. "Who are you?" "The divorce attorney your husband is going to regret meeting." That answer earned another laugh. Then a second person entered from a side room carrying coffee. She looked to be in her early 40s, sharp eyes, sharp suit, sharp posture. "Monica Ellis," she said. "Corporate litigation." My eyebrows lifted. "Why do I need corporate litigation?" Monica placed a thick folder on the table. "Because I don't think this story ends with a divorce." The room became quiet. She opened the folder and slid several documents toward me. "I've spent the last 48 hours reviewing public records connected to Vanguard Holdings." Vanguard Holdings was the family company. Officially, it specialized in commercial real estate development and investment management. Publicly, it was respected, stable, successful. Exactly the kind of company Atlanta's business community trusted. Monica tapped one document. "Something isn't right." I sat down. Pain shot through my ribs. I ignored it. Show me. For the next 2 hours, we built the first map. Names, companies, relationships, ownership structures, corporate officers, subsidiaries. Most people would have seen chaos. I saw patterns. That was always my strength. Numbers told stories. People lied. Numbers usually didn't. By mid-afternoon, a picture was beginning to emerge. Vanguard Holdings appeared healthy from the outside. Revenue looked stable. Assets looked strong. Debt levels looked manageable. Yet certain transactions kept repeating. Consulting fees, management fees, advisory payments. They moved between entities in circles that made no operational sense. Money laundering? Victor asked. Monica shook her head. Too early to say. I studied one page closely. Not laundering. Everyone looked at me. At least not traditional laundering. I pointed toward a sequence of payments. Somebody is creating artificial expenses. Kesha frowned. Why? To reduce reported profits. Monica nodded slowly. Keep going. I traced several entities with my finger. If profits fall, distributions fall. If distributions fall, fewer questions get asked about missing money. Victor leaned forward. You're saying somebody could be draining funds without attracting attention. I'm saying somebody has been very careful. The distinction mattered. Careful people were harder to catch. But they also left more complicated footprints. And complicated footprints fascinated me. By evening, the whiteboard had become crowded with names and arrows. Jamal appeared everywhere, not always directly. Sometimes through signatures, sometimes through approvals, sometimes through entities where he held no official position at all. Yet somehow his presence kept surfacing. Either he's unbelievably unlucky, Monica said, or he's connected to everything. I stared at the board. Nobody is that unlucky. Around 8 o'clock, Victor received a call. He stepped into the next room. When he returned, his expression had changed. We have a problem. My stomach tightened immediately. What happened? Terrence filed for temporary control of certain marital assets. I wasn't surprised. Based on the psychiatric narrative? Exactly. Kesha muttered a curse under her breath. Victor continued. The filing argues that your judgment may be impaired and requests restrictions on financial decision-making until further evaluation. Monica laughed once. They're moving faster than I expected. I looked at the whiteboard again. Everything fit. They weren't simply protecting a reputation. They were protecting access. Access to money, access to records, access to time. Every day I spent defending myself was another day they could move assets. Another day they could destroy evidence. Another day they could prepare, which meant I needed to move faster. We're asking the wrong question, I said suddenly. Everyone looked at me. What's the right question? Victor asked. I stood and approached the whiteboard. My ribs protested violently. I ignored them. Then I circled Jamal's name. We've been asking whether Jamal is stealing money. Monica nodded. That's a reasonable question. No. I shook my head. It's too small. The room fell silent. Then what should we be asking? Kesha said. I looked at the web of companies covering the board. What was he so afraid of losing that my unborn daughter became a threat? Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer. Yet, hours later, after everyone left for the night, I stayed downstairs alone reviewing records. One document kept pulling my attention back, a payment authorization buried inside a routine quarterly filing. Most people would have missed it. The amount wasn't huge, the wording wasn't unusual, but one detail made my pulse accelerate: the authorization date. Slowly, I compared it against another record, then another, then another. Suddenly, I stopped breathing. The transaction had been approved by a company officer who, according to state records, had already been dead for 11 months. I read the document again. Same name, same signature, same approval authority. Impossible. Dead people don't authorize financial transfers unless somebody wants them to. Dead people do not approve financial transactions. That fact kept repeating in my mind long after midnight. I sat alone in the basement staring at the authorization form while the rest of the house slept. The signature belonged to Harold Baines, a former Vanguard executive who had died from a heart attack nearly a year earlier. Yet according to the records in front of me, Harold had approved a 6-figure transfer 11 months after his funeral. There were only two possible explanations. Either the documents were wrong or somebody had forged his authority. By sunrise, I already knew which answer was more likely. When Monica arrived the next morning, I handed her the file without saying a word. She studied it for less than 30 seconds before looking up. This is bad. How bad? Prison bad. That was the first time anyone in the room used a word that serious. Until now, we had been talking about suspicious transactions, unusual accounting, and hidden ownership structures. Nobody had crossed the line into criminal exposure. Monica just did. Victor arrived shortly afterward carrying coffee and 3 new boxes of records obtained through public filings. We spent the next several hours tracing every transaction connected to the dead executive's authorization. At first, the transfers appeared ordinary. Money moved from Vanguard Holdings into consulting entities. Those consulting entities paid advisory firms. The advisory firms paid subcontractors. Everything looked professional. Everything looked legal. That was the point. Whoever built the system understood accounting. They understood audits. They understood exactly how to hide movement behind complexity. Most investigators searched for large thefts. Smart criminals created hundreds of smaller transactions instead. Small amounts attracted less attention. Small amounts survived longer. Small amounts accumulated. By early afternoon, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The same group of companies kept appearing. Different names. Different addresses. Different managers. Yet somehow the money always ended in the same place. Monica circled 6 entities on the whiteboard. Every road leads back here. I walked closer. My eyes immediately found the connection. These aren't independent companies. Victor nodded. Exactly. We started pulling ownership records. Some were registered in Georgia, others in Florida, a few in Delaware. The paperwork looked unrelated until we began comparing incorporation dates, registered agents, and mailing addresses. Then the picture changed. The companies weren't separate. They were pieces of a larger machine. Someone had deliberately scattered them across multiple states to make the trail harder to follow. Unfortunately for them, following trails was my specialty. 3 hours later, we found the first direct link to Jamal. It wasn't a bank account. It wasn't a signature. It wasn't even a payment. It was a private email address used during the registration process of 2 shell companies. The same address appeared again 6 months later in a corporate filing, then again in a vendor agreement. This belongs to him, I said. Monica zoomed in on the document. You sure? Positive. Years earlier, Jamal accidentally used that address when sending me family tax information. I never forgot it because he spent 20 minutes blaming his assistant for the mistake. Victor leaned back in his chair. So he's connected. I shook my head. No, connected is too weak. I pointed at the screen. He built part of it. The room fell silent. For the first time, suspicion was becoming evidence. Not enough evidence for court, not enough evidence for prosecutors, but enough evidence to change how we viewed the investigation. Jamal was no longer a possible participant. He was becoming the center of the map. Over the next week, our war room expanded. More files arrived, more records surfaced, more patterns emerged. Every day exposed another layer. Every day made the story bigger. Meanwhile, the Vaughn family continued pushing the psychiatric narrative. Terrence's attorneys filed additional motions questioning my stability. Anonymous rumors began circulating in social circles about my alleged breakdown. A local business publication even hinted that stress from infertility had affected my judgment. None of it was accidental. Somebody was feeding information into the rumor mill. Somebody wanted my credibility destroyed before the truth surfaced. The attacks angered me less than they once would have. The more they talked about my mental health, the more convinced I became they were terrified of what I might discover. Innocent people usually defended themselves. Guilty people attacked investigators. One evening, Kesha entered the basement carrying dinner and found me surrounded by spreadsheets. You've been staring at numbers for 12 hours. I barely looked up. I found another discrepancy. That's not healthy. Neither is attempted murder. She sighed and placed the food beside me. Then she noticed the screen. What's that? I turned the laptop toward her. A timing issue. Kesha frowned. Meaning? I highlighted a sequence of transactions. Look at the dates. She studied them carefully. I don't see it. Exactly. I zoomed in further. Nobody sees it because nobody compares them. The transfers always occurred within 48 hours of specific internal company reports, reports that were never made public, reports showing declining performance in certain divisions, reports available only to senior leadership. Kesha slowly understood. Somebody knew exactly when money could disappear without attracting attention. Yes, someone inside the company. Someone high enough to see everything. The implication hung in the air. Jamal had influence, but did he have that level of access? Maybe, maybe not. The question bothered me. Criminal schemes survive because people focus on obvious suspects. Real conspiracies often depend on people nobody notices. That thought stayed with me for days. Then everything changed on a Thursday afternoon. Monica burst into the basement holding a folder. "We got bank records." I stood immediately. "From who?" "One of the shell companies." My pulse accelerated. "What did you find?" She opened the folder and spread documents across the table. Wire transfers, deposits, withdrawals, hundreds of entries. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Then I noticed a recurring account number receiving payments. The same account appeared again and again, sometimes for $20,000, sometimes $50,000, sometimes more. Over 3 years, the total exceeded $2 million. Nobody spoke while I calculated the numbers. Finally, Victor broke the silence. "Can we identify the account holder?" Monica nodded slowly. "Yes." My heartbeat quickened. For weeks we had followed breadcrumbs. For weeks we had chased shadows. Now we finally had a destination. "Who is it?" I asked. Monica looked directly at me. Her expression had completely changed. Not excitement, not satisfaction. Concern. Genuine concern. "That's the problem." The room became very quiet. "Why?" I said. Monica slid the final page across the table. I looked down at the account owner. Then I froze. Because after everything we had uncovered, after every lie, every forged record, every suspicious transfer, the last name written on that bank account was the one name I never expected to see. Terrence Vaughn. For almost an hour, nobody in the room spoke. We simply stared at the name attached to the account. Terrence Vaughn, my husband. The man who had stood silent while his mother accused me of faking a pregnancy. The man who signed paperwork questioning my mental stability less than 24 hours after I nearly died. The man I had spent weeks convincing myself was weak rather than malicious. Now his name sat at the end of a financial trail worth more than $2 million. Victor finally broke the silence. Either he's involved or someone wants him to look involved. I stared at the documents spread across the table. Years of forensic accounting had taught me one important lesson. The obvious answer was rarely the correct one. If Jamal had really built an elaborate network of shell companies and hidden transfers, placing everything directly into Terrence's account would be reckless. Too reckless. Jamal was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. "Something doesn't fit," I said. Monica nodded. "I agree." She sat beside me and pointed towards several wire transfers. "Look at the timing." I studied the dates carefully. The transfers stretched over 3 years. Some arrived monthly. Others appeared quarterly. A few came after major company events. At first, nothing stood out. Then I noticed a pattern. Terrence never touched the money. Monica smiled slightly. Exactly. Every account statement showed the same thing. Funds entered. Funds remained untouched. No luxury purchases. No hidden withdrawals. No offshore transfers. Nothing. The money simply accumulated. If Terrence was stealing from the company, he was doing a terrible job of enjoying it. Could he even access the account? Victor asked. That question sent us down an entirely new path. By the following afternoon, we had an answer. The account existed in Terrence's name, but someone else had established automatic management authority years earlier, a legal arrangement hidden inside several layers of documentation. When Monica finally uncovered the paperwork, I felt a chill run through my body. "Who controls it?" I asked. Monica looked up from the file. "Not Terrence." "Then who?" She turned the page toward me. The signature belonged to Chloe Sinclair Vaughn. For several seconds, I honestly thought I had misread it. Chloe? The elegant socialite who spent her days hosting charity luncheons and posting inspirational quotes online? The woman who acted like financial statements were beneath her attention? It made no sense. until it made perfect sense. She's been managing the account? Victor asked. Since before the transfers started. Monica tapped the document. Legally authorized. Kesha shook her head. Why would Terrence agree to that? Nobody answered immediately. Then I remembered something. Years earlier, shortly after Jamal married Chloe, Vivan began praising her constantly. According to Vivan, Chloe possessed a natural talent for investments and wealth preservation. She was always recommending accountants, reviewing estate plans, and helping older relatives organize their finances. At the time, I thought it was another example of Vivan's favoritism. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe Chloe's role inside the family had always been larger than anyone realized. I want everything on her, I said. Monica raised an eyebrow. Everything? Everything. 2 weeks later, the image of Chloe Sinclair Vaughn looked very different. Publicly, she appeared flawless. Her social media showcased luxury vacations, charity galas, designer clothing, and inspirational messages about family values. Magazine profiles described her as a successful entrepreneur. Society pages treated her like Atlanta royalty. The problem was that none of it matched reality. The first crack appeared in her business records. The company she constantly promoted online wasn't particularly successful. In fact, it barely generated profit. The second crack appeared in her property records. Several assets she publicly implied she owned actually belonged to trusts controlled by other people. Then came the third crack. Debt. A staggering amount of debt. Credit obligations, private loans, personal guarantees, financial pressure hidden beneath a carefully constructed image of wealth. I sat staring at the reports while pieces began connecting. She needs money, I said quietly. A lot of money, Monica replied. Suddenly, Chloe's behavior at the rooftop dinner looked different. Her accusations, her confidence, her willingness to attack me publicly, none of it came from loyalty alone. She had skin in the game. My daughter threatened something she desperately needed. The more we investigated, the uglier the picture became. Several of Chloe's companies had received consulting payments from entities linked to Jamal's network. The amounts weren't large enough to attract immediate attention, but they were consistent, regular, predictable, like a salary disguised as business revenue. She's being paid, Victor said. For what? Kesha asked. Nobody knew, yet. Another week passed. More records surfaced. More connections emerged. Then one afternoon, Monica entered the war room carrying a folder she clearly found disturbing. She placed it on the table without speaking. What is it? I asked. Private litigation records. I opened the file. My eyes immediately landed on Chloe's name. Then another. Then another. Lawsuits. Confidential settlements. Debt disputes. Contract conflicts. None of them catastrophic by themselves. But together they painted a completely different picture from the woman Atlanta believed it knew. Chloe wasn't a queen sitting comfortably on top of society. She was balancing on the edge of a financial cliff while desperately pretending everything was fine. And desperate people often made dangerous decisions. How close is she to losing everything? I asked. Monica flipped through several pages. Closer than anyone realizes. That answer stayed with me, because suddenly the conspiracy felt more human. Jamal wanted money because he felt entitled to it. Vivan wanted control because power defined her identity. Terrence wanted peace because he feared conflict. Chloe wanted survival. For the first time, I could see the motivations driving each person. That didn't excuse their actions, but it explained them. 3 nights later, another anonymous package arrived at Kesha's house. This time there was no photograph, no note, only a flash drive. Victor immediately wanted it analyzed professionally. Monica agreed. We spent 24 hours verifying that it contained no malware before opening it. When the files finally appeared on the screen, the room fell silent. Security footage, dozens of clips from different locations, parking garages, restaurants, office buildings, hotels. Most showed ordinary meetings. Then one video appeared. My pulse accelerated immediately. Chloe sat inside a downtown restaurant booth. Across from her sat a man I had never seen before. The timestamp showed 6 months before the rooftop incident. The audio quality was poor, but one sentence came through clearly. Chloe leaned forward and said, "If the audit happens, we're finished." The man answered something we couldn't hear. Then Chloe said another sentence, one sentence that changed everything. Then we make sure the child never triggers the audit. The video ended seconds later. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Kesha looked at me. She knew. I stared at the frozen image on the screen. For weeks I had believed Chloe was helping cover up someone else's crime. Now a far more disturbing possibility emerged. She wasn't merely protecting the conspiracy. She might have been helping design it. And if that was true, the fall down the staircase suddenly looked a lot less spontaneous than anyone wanted us to believe. For nearly 2 weeks after finding the video of Chloe discussing the audit, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image. Viven's hands slamming into my chest, my body falling backward, the marble staircase rushing toward me. Until that moment, I had always viewed the attack through the lens of emotion. Rage, fear, desperation. A wealthy woman losing control during a public confrontation. But the video changed everything. Because if people were discussing ways to stop my unborn child months before the rooftop dinner, then the attack could no longer be explained as a spontaneous outburst. It had to be examined as part of a larger sequence of events, one built long before I ever announced my pregnancy. The realization terrified me because it forced me to ask a question I had spent months avoiding. What if they had intended to hurt me all along? The next morning, Monica arrived with a stack of newly acquired records. "I've been reviewing communication logs," she said. "Phone records, email metadata, meeting schedules." I immediately sat upright. "Find anything?" She dropped a folder onto the table. "Maybe." That single word was enough to make everyone in the room pay attention. Monica rarely speculated. If she said maybe, it meant something existed. We spent the next several hours reviewing timelines. Every major event from the previous year was mapped onto a large whiteboard. Fertility treatments, trust reviews, company audits, board meetings, family gatherings, financial transfers. At first, the information looked chaotic. Then patterns began emerging. One date in particular stood out. 3 days before the rooftop dinner, several unusual communications occurred within a 12-hour window. Jamal exchanged multiple calls with Chloe. Chloe contacted an attorney. Vivian held a private meeting with 2 senior company advisors. Then all communication stopped. Completely. "That's strange," Victor said. "Why?" Kesha asked. Victor pointed toward the chart. "Because people don't suddenly stop communicating unless they've already made a decision." The room fell silent. He was right. Human behavior followed predictable patterns. Long discussions led to decisions. Decisions led to action. The communication blackout suggested planning had already been completed. "What happened 3 days later?" Monica asked quietly. Nobody answered because everyone knew. The rooftop dinner happened 3 days later. I felt a knot form in my stomach. It wasn't evidence of a conspiracy. Not yet. But it wasn't random either. The timeline bothered me enough that we began digging deeper. By the end of the week, we discovered something else. The dinner itself had not been organized by Terrence. It had been organized by Vivian. That wasn't surprising. What surprised us was the guest list. The gathering had originally been scheduled as a private family dinner. Then, 48 hours before the event, Vivian expanded the invitation list. Several extended relatives were added. 2 influential family friends were added. Even a former company board member attended. "Why invite witnesses?" Kesha asked. I stared at the list. Because she expected something to happen. Nobody disagreed. Vivian controlled details obsessively. She never created larger audiences without a reason. The more we investigated, the more uncomfortable the facts became. Another discovery arrived the following Monday. One of Monica's investigators obtained surveillance footage from a private parking structure near downtown Atlanta. The video showed Jamal entering a conference room the day before the dinner. 10 minutes later, Chloe arrived. 20 minutes later, Vivian entered through a separate entrance. They remained inside together for nearly 2 hours. "Can we prove what they discussed?" Victor asked. Monica shook her head. "No audio." Disappointment spread across the room. Then she smiled slightly. "But we can prove the meeting happened." That mattered more than people realized. Conspiracies rarely collapsed because someone confessed. They collapsed because timelines exposed lies. Publicly, all three had claimed there were no unusual discussions before the dinner. The meeting alone proved those statements were false. We continued building the timeline, piece by piece, hour by hour, day by day. Then Kesha found something nobody expected. During her review of hospital records from the night of the incident, she noticed an unusual delay. "This doesn't make sense," she said. I moved beside her. "What?" She pointed at the emergency response timeline. The first call requesting medical assistance was logged immediately after the fall. The second call was placed 2 minutes later. The third call came from hotel security. Yet another gap existed before paramedics reached me. "Why is that important?" Victor asked. Kesha looked up. "Because someone accessed the family attorney before the ambulance arrived." The room went completely silent. "You're sure?" I asked. She nodded. "Positive." I stared at the report. Most people wouldn't notice something like that. Most people wouldn't understand why it mattered. But I did. If your first reaction after a tragic accident was calling a lawyer before paramedics reached the victim, then you weren't thinking about saving someone. You were thinking about protecting yourself. The realization sent chills through my body. We spent days verifying the information. Every check produced the same result. The attorney received a call before I reached the hospital, before doctors examined me, before anyone knew whether I would survive. "They were already managing liability," Monica said quietly. "Exactly." My voice sounded distant even to myself. Another week passed. More evidence accumulated. None of it individually proved attempted murder. Yet together it formed a picture that became harder and harder to ignore. The private meeting, the communication blackout, the expanded guest list, the audit discussion, the legal call before medical treatment. Each fact stood alone. Together they pointed in the same direction: planning. Then came the breakthrough. Late one evening, Monica called an emergency meeting in the war room. Everyone arrived within 30 minutes. She projected a newly acquired email onto the screen. "Read the timestamp," she said. I looked immediately. The message had been sent 6 days before the dinner. From an executive assistant working for Vanguard Holdings. The recipient list included Vivin, Jamal, and Chloe. The subject line seemed harmless: event preparation. Then I read the body. My heartbeat accelerated. Most of the message discussed seating arrangements and catering. Then a single sentence appeared near the bottom. One sentence buried among dozens of logistical details. One sentence someone clearly hoped nobody would notice. "All parties confirmed for Thursday's discussion before implementation." I read it again. Then again. Discussion before implementation. Not celebration, not dinner. Implementation. Victor slowly leaned back in his chair. "That's not how people describe a family announcement." "No," Monica agreed. "It isn't." Nobody spoke for several seconds, because everyone in the room understood the implication. Somewhere before that dinner, a plan existed. We still didn't know exactly what the plan was. We still couldn't prove who created it. But for the first time, I no longer believed I was investigating a terrible accident. I believed I was investigating a failed operation. Then Monica opened one final file. "There's something else." She projected a calendar entry recovered from a company server. My eyes immediately locked onto the participants: Vivin, Jamal, Chloe, and one more name, a name I had not expected to see anywhere near this timeline. The meeting had occurred the morning of the dinner, 4 hours before I announced my pregnancy, 4 hours before the fall, 4 hours before my life changed forever. And sitting inside that meeting was the same attorney who later received a phone call before paramedics reached me. The attorney's name changed everything. Until that moment, we had been chasing fragments. Suspicious transfers, private meetings, forged narratives, hidden accounts. Every discovery pointed toward wrongdoing, but none of them explained the most important question: why had they been so terrified of my child? $6 million was significant money, but wealthy families fought over inheritances every day without throwing pregnant women down staircases. Something larger sat beneath the surface, something worth risking prison to protect. For the next 10 days, our war room focused entirely on one objective: understanding the trust. Not the public version, not the sanitized explanation Terrence had given me years earlier, the real version. the version hidden inside legal filings, trustee correspondence, and estate planning records. It turned out that Terrence's grandfather had been far more intelligent than anyone in the Vaughn family realized. 20 years earlier, after watching several relatives destroy portions of the family fortune through greed and mismanagement, he created a series of protections designed to prevent future abuse. Most heirs only cared about the money. Very few paid attention to the conditions. That was a mistake, because the conditions were where the real power existed. Victor finally obtained a copy of the complete trust documents through a legal contact. The package arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, nearly 300 pages, amendments, supplements, trustee notes, corporate agreements. I spent 2 straight days reading every word. By the third night, my eyes burned from exhaustion. Then I found it, one paragraph buried inside a section almost nobody would ever read. I sat upright so quickly that pain shot through my ribs. "Oh my God." Kesha immediately looked up. "What?" I didn't answer. I kept reading. Then I read it again. Then a third time. Monica crossed the room. "Jada?" I slowly turned the document toward them. "The child isn't the trigger." Nobody understood. "What does that mean?" Victor asked. I pointed at the clause. "Everyone thinks the trust activates when Terrence has a biological heir. That's what we've been told. That's what they've been told." I shook my head. "That's not what this says." The room fell silent. For the first time since the investigation began, I felt like I was looking directly at the center of the maze. "Then explain it," Monica said. My finger traced the language carefully. "The heir triggers a mandatory governance review." Nobody spoke. "Meaning?" Kesha asked. I looked directly at her. "Meaning the moment a biological heir is confirmed, independent auditors automatically gain access to every company, trust, partnership, and investment vehicle connected to the family assets." The room went completely still. Victor was the first to understand. "That's why they're panicking." "Yes." My voice barely rose above a whisper. "The $6 million isn't the real issue." Everything suddenly fit together. The secret meetings, the forged records, the desperate attacks, the fake psychiatric narrative, the missing money, the shell companies. None of it was about inheritance. Inheritance was merely the countdown clock. The real threat was the audit. If my daughter was born and legally recognized as Terrence's heir, outside auditors would gain authority to examine years of financial activity, every hidden transfer, every shell company, every suspicious payment, everything. Monica immediately grabbed the document. "How extensive is the review?" "Extensive enough to terrify criminals." The realization hit everyone at once. Jamal wasn't trying to steal $6 million. He was trying to prevent someone from discovering where much larger amounts had gone. Suddenly, the conspiracy became logical. Terrence's upcoming 36th birthday created a deadline. My pregnancy threatened that timeline. My daughter represented exposure. Exposure represented investigation. Investigation represented collapse. For weeks we had been asking why they feared my child. Now we finally had an answer. Because my child was a key, the next few days transformed our understanding of everything. We stopped treating financial irregularities as isolated incidents. Instead, we began viewing them through the lens of audit avoidance. Immediately, patterns became clearer. Several suspicious transactions occurred shortly before mandatory reporting periods. Certain accounts appeared designed to conceal ownership. Others seemed structured specifically to survive limited scrutiny while collapsing under deeper examination. "They've been preparing for this possibility for years," Monica said. "Exactly. Nobody creates systems this complicated overnight. Whatever was happening inside Vanguard Holdings had likely been developing long before I became pregnant. Long before the dinner. Long before the staircase. The trust merely forced a deadline. 3 days later, another major breakthrough arrived. One of Monica's investigators obtained access to archived correspondence involving Jamal. Most of it was ordinary business communication. Then, a particular email chain surfaced. The messages discussed internal concerns about future governance reviews. At first, the language seemed vague. Then one phrase appeared repeatedly. Containment strategy. Every time I saw those words, they were connected to discussions about succession planning and trust activation. Containment strategy, Victor repeated. That's not normal corporate language. Not in this context. I agreed. The wording sounded less like business planning and more like crisis management, as if certain people already knew what would happen if auditors ever looked too closely. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about one question. If Jamal knew the audit would expose him, who else knew? The answer arrived sooner than expected. 2 days later, Monica entered the war room carrying a folder she clearly wished she didn't have. She dropped it on the table and exhaled slowly. You need to see this. Inside were internal company communications recovered from a backup server. Most were routine. Then I found an exchange between two senior employees discussing concerns over upcoming succession events. One employee wrote that an external audit could expose historical discrepancies. The second employee responded with a sentence that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Vaughn is aware and has approved the protection plan. Nobody needed clarification regarding which Mrs. Vaughn they meant. Vivian. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Deep down, I already suspected she knew. Yet suspicion and confirmation were not the same thing. This was the first evidence placing her inside the conspiracy before my pregnancy announcement. Before the dinner. Before the fall. She wasn't reacting to a crisis, I whispered. She was protecting a system. Monica nodded. That's what it looks like. Suddenly, Vivan's actions became frighteningly logical. She wasn't defending family reputation. She wasn't defending her sons. She was defending years of hidden activity, years of decisions, years of secrets, and my daughter threatened to expose all of it. By the end of the week, the pieces finally connected. Not every detail, not every participant, but enough. Jamal needed the audit stopped. Chloe needed the money. Vivian needed the truth buried. Terrence remained the only variable we still couldn't fully explain. Whether he was involved or manipulated remained unclear. Yet one fact no longer had room for debate. The attack on me had never been about emotion. It had never been about a family argument. It had never been about losing control during a dinner. It was the final step of a containment strategy. A strategy designed to stop a child from ever triggering the one event capable of exposing everything. Late that evening, while reviewing the trust documents one final time, I discovered a schedule attached to the governance review process. My eyes immediately locked onto the date. The mandatory audit wouldn't begin when my daughter turned 18. It wouldn't begin years later. It would begin within 30 days of her legal recognition as an heir. 30 days. That was all it would take to bring the entire structure crashing down. And for the first time since the fall, I understood exactly why they had been willing to risk murder. Because if my daughter was born, they weren't losing $6 million. They were losing the ability to hide what they had already taken. Once I understood that my daughter would trigger the audit they were terrified of, the investigation changed from gathering evidence to choosing a battlefield. Evidence alone was not enough. I had seen too many powerful families bury ugly truths behind private settlements, sealed filings, and quiet resignations. If I moved too early, Vivian would wrap everything in legal language, Jamal would blame clerical errors, Chloe would cry into a camera, and Terrence would pretend he had been confused by everyone around him. They would survive because their entire world was built to protect people like them. So I needed more than proof. I needed an audience they could not control. For 3 days, I studied every upcoming Vanguard event, board meeting, charity luncheon, investor reception, and country club dinner. Most were too small. Some were too private. A few were legally useless because phones would be banned and security would lock down the room. Then Monica found the invitation draft buried inside a vendor contract. Legacy Gala. The name alone made my stomach turn. Vivian was planning an elite black tie celebration at the Peachtree Country Club on Terrence's 36th birthday, the exact date tied to the grandfather's trust. The guest list included board members, investors, judges, church leaders, wealthy donors, local politicians, and half the Atlanta social circle that had spent months whispering that I was unstable. I read the program twice before I understood the real purpose. This was not just a birthday celebration. It was a coronation. Vivian planned to stand in front of the entire city and announce that Terrence had failed to produce a legitimate heir, that his marriage had collapsed because of my so-called breakdown, and that Jamal would step forward as the responsible future of the Vanguard family. She wanted the room to applaud while they buried me alive. I handed the program to Victor. This is where they plan to make the lie permanent. He read silently, then looked up. And if you appear there? Monica answered before I could. Then the lie dies in public. The room went quiet because everyone understood what that meant. Public exposure was powerful, but it was dangerous. If we walked into that gala without airtight proof, Vivian would turn the crowd against me before I reached the podium. If we revealed too much too soon, Jamal could move assets before regulators acted. If we pushed Terrence too hard, he might panic and become useful to his family again. Every step had to be exact. No drama for drama's sake, no emotional speeches without evidence, no accusations we could not prove. The next morning, we began building the gala plan. Monica focused on the financial records. Victor focused on court filings, custody protections, and legal boundaries. Kesha focused on protecting my medical records and documenting my pregnancy through independent physicians who could not be bought by Vivian. I focused on the timeline. Every lie needed a timestamp. Every transfer needed a source. Every accusation needed a document behind it. The plan had to unfold in layers. First, destroy the pregnancy lie, then expose the fake medical narrative, then reveal the trust mechanism, then show why the audit terrified them. Then connect Jamal and Chloe to the money. Finally, prove Vivian knew before the staircase. The order mattered. If the room believed the baby was real first, every other lie began to weaken. If the room saw the money second, the motive became clear. If the room heard Vivian's knowledge last, her entire image collapsed. For the first time, I felt something close to control. Not peace, not yet, but control. 2 weeks later, the first outside specialist signed the pregnancy verification. A maternal fetal medicine doctor confirmed gestational age, viability, and medical consistency. 1 week after that, a second independent lab confirmed the genetic material needed for prenatal paternity testing. Victor insisted on making everything court-ready. No shortcuts, he said. If they attack one document, we need 3 more standing behind it. He was right. Vivian had already shown me what wealthy people did when cornered. They did not simply deny, they manufactured alternatives. So we built a record too heavy for denial. Meanwhile, I stayed hidden. That was the hardest part. Terrence kept calling through blocked numbers. At first, his messages sounded confused, then injured, then angry. He claimed I was being manipulated by Kesha. He said his mother only wanted what was best for everyone. He said if I returned quietly, they could avoid public embarrassment. Not once did he ask what I remembered from the staircase. Not once did he ask whether our child was safe. Every message confirmed what I already knew. He was not searching for truth. He was searching for comfort. Vivian moved even more aggressively. Her lawyers sent letters demanding access to my medical status. Jamal's people tried to contact former colleagues at my firm. Chloe began leaking small, poisonous stories through social circles. Stories about fertility, grief, emotional instability, obsession, and financial desperation. The rumors reached me through screenshots, forwarded messages, and worried acquaintances who still had enough decency to warn me. I did not respond. Silence made them confident. Confidence made them careless. By the 5th month of my pregnancy, the Legacy Gala had become the most anticipated society event of the season. Vivian's team released elegant announcements about family resilience, generational leadership, and honoring the late grandfather's vision. Every phrase was designed to make them look noble before they stole control. I read each announcement and saved it, not because it hurt, because hypocrisy becomes useful when documented. Around that time, Monica obtained the final piece we needed for access. A VIP invitation had been issued in my legal married name before Vivian's office realized it should be canceled. The cancellation never reached the country club database because the event coordinator quit 2 days later. Monica smiled when she showed me. "You're still on the list." Victor frowned. "That may get you through the front door, but not onto the stage." I placed one hand on my growing stomach. I don't need permission to walk into a room where my life is being discussed. The plan sharpened after that. We secured a private security team, not to threaten anyone, but to keep Vivian's people from touching me. Monica arranged for backup copies of evidence to be released automatically if anyone tried to remove me. Victor prepared emergency filings tied to the trust, the pregnancy verification, and the false medical claims. Kesha documented every prenatal appointment and kept sealed copies in multiple locations. I spent nights rehearsing not speeches, but sequence, the order of truth. The room had to feel each revelation tighten around them until there was no escape left. Still, fear visited me sometimes. Usually at night, when the penthouse was quiet and my daughter kicked beneath my ribs, I would sit by the window and wonder what kind of mother walks voluntarily into a room full of people who already tried to erase her. Then she would move again, strong and undeniable, and I would remember. A mother who knows running only teaches predators to chase. 7 months after the fall, my body had changed completely. My belly was no longer something they could call imaginary. My daughter was active, healthy, and impossible to dismiss. I had gained weight, strength, and a calmness that frightened even me. The old Jada, the woman who wanted approval from a family that despised her, was gone. In her place stood someone quieter and far more dangerous. 3 nights before the gala, the final anonymous email arrived. No subject line, no greeting, just one attachment and a sentence. They are announcing Jamal before dessert. The attachment contained the final run of show. Vivian's speech. Terrence's prepared remarks. Jamal's introduction. Even a section titled, Family Transition Narrative. I opened that file and read the line they planned to use about me. Due to a painful private health crisis, Jada Reynolds has stepped away from the family indefinitely. I stared at those words for a long time. They had already written me out of my own life. Then I printed the program, placed it beside the medical records, the trust documents, the bank trails, and the video evidence, and locked everything inside a black leather case. The next morning, I stood in front of my mirror wearing the emerald gown I had chosen for the gala. It was elegant, fitted, and impossible to misunderstand. My daughter kicked hard as if she knew we were done hiding. I looked at my reflection and felt no fear, no grief, no need to be believed by people who had chosen lies because lies were convenient. Vivian wanted a stage. Jamal wanted a crown. Chloe wanted the money to keep pretending she was untouchable. Terrence wanted a version of the truth that did not make him a coward. They were all going to receive exactly what they deserved, in the one place their power depended on most. In public. 7 months after I fell down a marble staircase, Atlanta gathered to celebrate my disappearance. That was the thought running through my mind as the black SUV rolled beneath the illuminated entrance of the Peachtree Country Club. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Valets moved with military precision. Photographers stood near the entrance documenting arrivals. Through the glass facade, I could already see chandeliers reflecting off polished floors and hundreds of people dressed in black tie elegance. The city's wealthiest families had arrived. Business leaders, investors, judges, charity board members, political donors, people who spent years building their reputations carefully, people whose opinions shaped careers and fortunes. Vivian Vaughn had chosen her audience well. She always did. She wanted witnesses when she buried someone. Tonight, she expected those witnesses to watch her bury me. Monica sat beside me in the SUV reviewing final notes. Victor occupied the front seat. Kesha squeezed my hand. Nobody spoke much during the drive because everything important had already been said. Every document had been verified. Every backup plan had been prepared. Every legal protection had been filed. Months of work had led to a single evening. A single room. A single opportunity. If we executed correctly, the truth would become impossible to contain. If we failed, Vivian would spend the next decade convincing the world that I was exactly who she claimed I was. Ready? Kesha asked quietly. I looked down at my stomach. My daughter shifted beneath the emerald gown. Strong, healthy, real. The child they tried to erase had become the reason I was still standing. Yes, I said. I'm ready. The ballroom was already full when we entered through a private side entrance. Music floated through the room. Waiters carried champagne. Investors shook hands. Old money greeted new money. At the center of it all stood Vivian, confident, elegant, untouchable. She wore a dark sapphire gown and enough diamonds to remind everyone who she believed she was. From a distance, nobody would have guessed she had shoved a pregnant woman down a staircase. That was her gift. She understood appearances. She understood how easily people confused elegance with morality. Across the room, Jamal looked even happier. He moved from table to table accepting congratulations he hadn't earned yet. Every smile seemed larger than the one before. Every conversation carried the confidence of a man who believed victory was already secured. Chloe remained close to him, flawless as always. If anyone noticed the growing cracks beneath her carefully constructed image, they didn't show it. She laughed at jokes, accepted compliments, posed for photographs. The perfect society wife, the perfect lie. And then there was Terrence. The moment I saw him, something unexpected happened. I felt nothing. No anger, no heartbreak, no longing. For months I had wondered how I would react when we finally stood in the same room again. The answer surprised me. He looked smaller, not physically, spiritually, like a man who had spent too long convincing himself that avoiding responsibility was the same thing as innocence. He stood near the stage speaking with board members, while occasionally glancing toward the ballroom entrance, waiting, looking for someone. Looking for me. The irony almost made me smile. 7 months earlier, he watched me leave a dinner table alone. Tonight, he was searching for the woman he helped abandon. At precisely 8 o'clock, the program began. Guests moved toward their assigned tables. Lights dimmed slightly. Soft applause spread through the room as Vivian approached the stage. She looked magnificent, confident, controlled. Every inch the respected matriarch Atlanta expected her to be. "Good evening," she began. Her voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom. Years of public speaking had made her exceptionally effective. She thanked donors, recognized business partners, honored family traditions, mentioned her late father-in-law, mentioned legacy, mentioned responsibility. Every word had been carefully selected, every sentence designed to reinforce the image she wanted the world to see. I watched from a private corridor near the rear entrance while she slowly guided the audience exactly where she wanted them emotionally. Then she transitioned. "As many of you know," she said gently, "the past year has brought unexpected challenges to our family." The room immediately became attentive. "Here it comes," I thought. Vivian lowered her eyes briefly, performing sadness. "Some situations are deeply personal and deserve compassion rather than public discussion." Several people nodded sympathetically. She continued, "However, because rumors have circulated, I believe honesty is important. More nods, more sympathy." She was building trust before delivering the lie. Classic Vivian. "A painful health crisis affected one of our family members. We have done everything possible to provide support, privacy, and professional care." My jaw tightened. Around the room, people listened respectfully. They had no reason not to. They didn't know what she had done. They only knew the version of reality she was offering them. While recovery remains ongoing, difficult decisions regarding leadership and succession must still be made. There it was. Succession. The entire reason for the gala, the entire reason for months of manipulation, the entire reason my daughter became a target. Vivian smiled toward Jamal. "Tonight, I am proud to recognize a family member whose commitment, stability, and leadership have strengthened Vanguard Holdings during a challenging period." Applause began immediately. Jamal stood and waved modestly. The performance was almost perfect. Almost, because one problem remained. The person they had written out of the story wasn't gone. As applause continued, Vivian looked toward the front tables and prepared to continue her speech. Then, something changed. I watched her expression freeze, at first only slightly, then completely. The applause began fading, conversations slowed, heads started turning, one after another, like a wave moving through the ballroom. People weren't looking at the stage anymore. They were looking toward the entrance. I stepped forward from the corridor and entered the room. Silence spread faster than applause ever could. Hundreds of eyes locked onto me instantly. Some widened, some blinked in confusion. Others simply stared. Because the woman they believed was unstable, hidden away, and recovering from a private breakdown had just walked into the most important social event of the year, very visibly pregnant, very healthy, very real. Every step echoed across polished marble. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. I walked past tables filled with donors, executives, and investors. Past people who had heard whispers about me for months. Past people who suddenly realized those whispers might not have been true. Across the room, Jamal's smile vanished. Chloe's face drained of color. Terrence looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. But Vivan's reaction interested me most. For the first time since I met her, she looked afraid. Not angry, not irritated, afraid. Because she immediately understood what everyone else was only beginning to realize. If I was standing there healthy and visibly pregnant, then the story she spent 7 months selling was about to collapse. I stopped in the center aisle. The ballroom remained completely silent. Somewhere in the back of the room, a champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor. Nobody even turned toward the sound. Every eye remained fixed on me. Then Vivian gripped the podium tighter and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Jada," she said. "What a surprise." I returned the smile. "Actually, Vivian," I replied loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "I think the surprises are just getting started." For several seconds after I spoke, nobody in the ballroom moved. The silence felt almost physical, pressing against the walls, the tables, the stage, and every carefully crafted lie that had brought us there. Vivan recovered first. She always did. Years of controlling rooms had taught her how to survive uncomfortable moments. She smiled politely and stepped away from the podium. "Jada," she said warmly, as though we had simply run into each other at a charity luncheon, "we're happy to see you're doing better." A few nervous laughs floated through the room. People wanted normalcy. They wanted this moment explained in a way that didn't threaten the comfortable version of reality they had accepted for months. I continued walking toward the stage. "Doing better?" I repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words." Vivan's smile remained fixed. "You've been through a difficult health situation." There it was. The narrative. The same narrative they had spent 7 months feeding to anyone willing to listen. I climbed the stairs slowly, conscious of every eye watching me. By the time I reached the stage, the ballroom was completely silent again. "Tell them," I said. Vivian blinked once. "Tell them what?" "Tell them about my health situation." The smile on her face tightened slightly. Around us, investors, judges, business leaders, and socialites leaned forward in their chairs. Nobody wanted to miss a word. "This isn't the place for private family matters," Vivan replied. "Funny," I said. "Because you seem perfectly comfortable discussing them when I'm not in the room." A murmur spread through the audience. Small, subtle, but important. People were beginning to sense tension beneath the polished surface. Jamal immediately moved toward the stage. "Jada, maybe we should have this conversation somewhere else." "Why?" I asked. "Because witnesses make you nervous?" His jaw tightened. "Good. Let him feel uncomfortable. Let all of them feel uncomfortable. For 7 months they had spoken about me while I wasn't present. Tonight they could finally speak with me standing directly in front of them." Vivian attempted to regain control. "Nobody here wants conflict." "Then maybe nobody here should have accused a pregnant woman of inventing her child." That landed exactly the way I intended. The room became noticeably quieter. Several people exchanged glances, others looked toward Terrence. He stood frozen near the front table, unable to decide whether to support me, support his mother, or disappear entirely. For once, indecision wasn't helping him. "You were concerned," Vivian said carefully. "Concerned?" I laughed softly. "You called my baby a scam." No response. "You called me delusional." Still no response. "You told people I was mentally unstable." The silence was becoming dangerous now. Not for me, for them. Because every accusation I listed sounded increasingly unreasonable while I stood in front of hundreds of people visibly pregnant. Finally, Chloe stepped forward. "Jada, nobody doubted that you believed you were pregnant." I turned toward her. Interesting wording. Her confidence faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, that's not what you said 7 months ago." She looked away first. That alone told me everything. I opened the leather case I had carried into the ballroom and removed a folder. Then another. Then another. The sound of paper against the podium seemed unusually loud in the silence. "For 7 months," I said, addressing the audience directly, "a very specific story has circulated through Atlanta. Some of you heard it from business associates, some from mutual friends. Some probably heard it from people standing on this stage." Nobody interrupted. The story claimed that stress and infertility caused me to imagine a pregnancy that never existed. Several heads nodded uncomfortably. They had heard the rumor. Of course they had. That was the point. Tonight I'd like to address that claim. I removed the first document. This is an independent medical report from a maternal fetal medicine specialist. Then another. This is a second verification from a separate physician. Then another. This is prenatal genetic testing. The room remained silent. And this, I continued, lifting the final document, is confirmation of paternity. Across the room, Terrence's face lost all color. I looked directly at him. Would you like me to read the result? He said nothing. I'll save everyone some time. I placed the document on the podium. Terrence Vaughn is the biological father of my daughter. The reaction was immediate. Conversations erupted across the ballroom, not loud, not chaotic, but impossible to stop. Investors whispered. Couples exchanged looks. Several people glanced toward Vivian. Others stared openly at Chloe. The foundation of the lie had just cracked. Vivian stepped forward quickly. Medical records can be manipulated. The room immediately quieted again. Everyone wanted to see where this was going. I smiled. I agree. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Which is why every document has already been verified through independent legal review. I nodded toward Victor. He stood near the rear of the room. Copies have also been submitted to multiple attorneys and trustees. Vivian's expression changed. She understood what that meant. The evidence could no longer disappear. The strategy that worked for 7 months was no longer available. You're making a mistake, she said quietly. No. I looked directly at her. The mistake happened when you assumed nobody would ever challenge the lie. Jamal stepped toward the microphone. This proves she's pregnant now. It doesn't prove what happened 7 months ago. There it was, the first retreat. They could no longer deny the pregnancy existed. So they shifted the argument. A smaller battlefield, a weaker position. Exactly what I wanted. You're right, I said. Jamal looked surprised. I am? Absolutely. I turned back toward the audience. This evidence doesn't prove what happened 7 months ago. For a brief moment, relief appeared across several Vaughn faces. Then I continued. But someone else can. The relief disappeared instantly. Across the ballroom, every head turned as a side door opened. The woman who entered wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't politically connected. Yet her arrival changed the atmosphere more dramatically than anything I had said all night. Dr. Jada Reynolds walked into the room carrying a sealed medical file. She moved calmly through the crowd and stopped beside the stage. Then she looked directly at Vivian. I remember exactly what happened 7 months ago, she said. The ballroom fell silent. Again. Because I was the physician who examined Jada less than an hour after she was pushed down that staircase. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the waiters had stopped walking. Kesha placed the sealed file on the podium. Then she looked out across the audience. And what I found that night was not a woman inventing a pregnancy. Her eyes shifted back toward Vivian. It was a woman trying desperately to protect a child that somebody wanted erased. The silence that followed felt heavier than every lie told during the previous 7 months combined. The moment the evidence of the fraud appeared on the ballroom screens, the room stopped looking at Jamal as a future leader and started looking at him as a potential criminal. That alone should have been enough to destroy the evening. It wasn't. Because as I stood beneath the chandeliers and watched investors whisper among themselves, I realized something important. Jamal had spent years stealing money, but Jamal was not the person everyone trusted. He was not the face hanging on charity brochures. He was not the person who controlled board appointments, family decisions, and social influence. That person was Vivian Vaughn. If the truth stopped with Jamal, people would tell themselves a comfortable story. They would say one greedy son betrayed a respected family. They would say the matriarch had been deceived. They would say the system failed because of one bad actor. That story would protect the very person who made everything possible. I wasn't going to let that happen. Across the ballroom, Vivian remained standing beside the podium. To her credit, she was fighting harder than anyone else. Jamal looked shaken. Chloe looked terrified. Terrence looked lost. But Vivian was still calculating, still searching for a path out, still trying to determine which version of the truth would cause the least damage. I had watched her do it for years. Every crisis became a public relations problem. Every betrayal became a misunderstanding. Every victim became an inconvenience. She didn't solve problems, she managed perceptions. Unfortunately for her, perception was about to become impossible to manage. Some of you are probably asking the same question right now, I said, turning toward the audience. How could a fraud this large continue for so many years without anyone noticing? Nobody answered, but dozens of faces told me I was right. Investors wanted explanations, board members wanted explanations, donors wanted explanations. Everyone wanted to know how millions of dollars disappeared beneath the nose of one of Atlanta's most respected business families. I looked directly at Vivan. That's an excellent question. For the first time that evening, her confidence cracked. Only slightly, but I saw it. So did several people in the front row. Jada, she said carefully. You've made your point. No, I replied. I haven't. I opened another folder from the leather case. The reaction in the room was immediate. People leaned forward again, because by now they understood a pattern. Every time I opened a folder, someone's life became worse. For 7 months, I continued, I asked myself a simple question. Did Vivan Vaughn know what was happening? Vivan immediately stepped toward the microphone. This is ridiculous. I ignored her. Did she know money was being moved? Did she know shell companies existed? Did she know documents were being manipulated? Did she know why my daughter represented a threat? I paused. Tonight we finally have the answer. The ballroom became completely silent. Monica approached the stage carrying a small digital projector remote. She handed it to me without speaking. Then she stepped back. I pressed a button. A series of emails appeared on the large screen behind us. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Internal communications, scheduling messages, routine corporate correspondence. Then I enlarged one specific section. A date appeared, then a sender, then a recipient. Finally, a sentence. Mrs. Vaughn is aware and has approved the protection plan. A wave of whispers swept through the room. Not loud. Not dramatic. Worse. Controlled disbelief. The kind that spreads when people suddenly realize a story is changing in real time. Vivan stared at the screen. For the first time all night, she looked genuinely unprepared. That's taken out of context, she said. Her voice sounded sharper now. Less elegant. Less controlled. Then give us the context, I replied. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out, because there was no good explanation, not one that survived scrutiny. I pressed another button. A second email appeared, then a third, then a fourth. Different dates, different senders, same theme. Discussions about audit exposure. Discussions about succession concerns. Discussions about containment strategies. And every path led back to the same destination, Vivan Vaughn. You didn't accidentally miss the warning signs, I said. You received them. Another email appeared. You didn't learn about the risks after the fact. Another email. You discussed them before they happened. Another email. And when people inside the company expressed concern, you approved plans designed to keep everything hidden. Vivan's face lost color with each new document. Around the room, people were no longer looking at her with admiration. They were studying her, reevaluating years of assumptions, rewriting opinions in real time. Reputation takes decades to build and minutes to destroy. I could see the destruction happening. Slowly. Publicly. Irreversibly. This isn't proof of a crime, Vivan said suddenly. No, I agreed. It's proof of knowledge. That distinction mattered. A great deal. I wasn't accusing her of moving every dollar. I was accusing her of something equally devastating. Knowing. Knowing and doing nothing. Knowing and protecting the people responsible. Knowing and choosing family power over truth. Investors could forgive mistakes. They rarely forgave deception. One of the senior board members stood from his table. I recognized him immediately. He had known Vivan for more than 20 years. Vivan, he said quietly, is this real? The question hit harder than any accusation, because it came from someone who wanted to believe her, someone giving her one final chance. The entire ballroom waited. Vivan looked at the screen, then at the board member, then at the audience. For several seconds, nobody moved. Finally, she said, "You don't understand everything that was at stake." The room reacted instantly. Some gasped, others shook their heads. A few simply closed their eyes, because she had just answered the question without realizing it. Not a denial, not a challenge, not a claim of innocence, a justification. At stake? I repeated. You mean the audit? Her eyes snapped toward me. Too late. The damage was done. She knew. Everyone could see she knew. The respected matriarch who spent years lecturing others about responsibility had just admitted she prioritized protecting herself over protecting the truth. Then Monica handed me one final document, the strongest one. I looked at it once before placing it beneath the camera feed connected to the ballroom screens. The image appeared above us immediately. It was a meeting authorization. The date matched the week before the rooftop dinner. The participants included Jamal, Chloe, company advisors, and Vivian. Near the bottom sat a handwritten note. Short, simple, devastating. Proceed before audit trigger becomes unavoidable. The ballroom erupted. Not chaos, not shouting. Worse, people stood. Investors pulled out phones. Board members began talking among themselves. Several guests started walking toward the exits. The social death of Vivian Vaughn had officially begun. And as she stared at the screen displaying her own words, she finally understood something I had known for months. The truth she spent years controlling no longer belonged to her. The moment investors started pulling out their phones, the ballroom stopped being a celebration and became a crime scene with chandeliers. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. You could feel the shift happening. For hours, Vivian had tried to control the room through reputation. Then documents appeared, emails appeared, financial trails appeared. Suddenly reputation no longer mattered. Evidence mattered. Across the ballroom, conversations fractured into smaller groups. Board members gathered near the stage. Attorneys began texting clients. Donors quietly stepped away from family representatives they had spent years supporting. The social collapse was already underway. The legal collapse arrived even faster. Victor's phone rang first. He listened for less than 30 seconds before ending the call. His expression told me everything. What happened? I asked. The trustees saw the live stream. A murmur spread among our team. I wasn't surprised. The gala had been designed as a public event. Guests had already started recording. Clips were moving across social media faster than anyone could stop them. What surprised me was the speed. And? The trust review has been activated. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. 7 months of investigation, 7 months of lies, 7 months of protecting evidence. The trigger they feared most had finally happened. Not because my daughter had been born yet, but because the trustees now had documented evidence that the succession process itself may have been compromised. Victor continued. Emergency Review Authority has been invoked. Monica smiled slightly. That's going to ruin somebody's evening. Across the room, Jamal was still trying to speak with board members. Nobody seemed interested anymore. Several executives were actively avoiding him. One investor physically turned his back and walked away in the middle of a conversation. Watching the change was almost surreal. Wealth creates the illusion of loyalty. Exposure reveals how little loyalty actually exists. Then another phone rang. Monica answered. Her expression changed immediately. You're kidding. She listened for several seconds. When? More listening. Then she slowly lowered the phone. IRS criminal investigation just requested preservation notices. The room went quiet again. Even Victor looked surprised. Already? Monica nodded. Apparently they received materials earlier this afternoon. Earlier this afternoon. I immediately understood what happened. Someone else had been investigating. Someone we didn't know about. Someone who had already noticed irregularities before our public exposure. The gala didn't start the investigation. It accelerated one that already existed. That realization explained several mysteries. Anonymous leaks, anonymous packages, anonymous warnings. Perhaps we were never the only people following the trail. Jamal must have sensed something changing because he suddenly grabbed a microphone. Everyone needs to calm down. Bad move. The room immediately focused on him. He forced a smile. There are explanations for everything you've seen tonight. Nobody applauded. Nobody supported him. The silence was devastating. He continued anyway. Complex corporate structures often look suspicious to people who don't understand them. Several executives exchanged looks. One actually laughed. Jamal heard it. Everyone heard it. The sound hit harder than a direct accusation. For years, he had relied on confidence to carry him through difficult situations. Tonight, confidence wasn't working anymore. Facts had replaced charisma. Then a voice interrupted him from the rear of the ballroom. Does that explanation cover tax fraud too? Every head turned. Two men and one woman were entering through the main doors. They weren't dressed like guests. Dark suits, identification badges, professional expressions. The room instantly recognized what they represented. Nobody needed introductions. Nobody needed explanations. Federal investigators have a certain presence. They don't ask for attention. They simply arrive and watch attention find them. Jamal's face went white, completely white. The lead investigator approached calmly. Mr. Vaughn? Jamal didn't answer. Mr. Vaughn? Still silence. Finally, yes? The investigator handed him a document. You are being instructed to preserve all financial records, electronic communications, devices, and corporate materials connected to the entities listed here. The ballroom became silent enough to hear paper moving. Jamal stared at the notice. His hands were shaking, actually shaking. For the first time all evening, he looked exactly like what he was. Not a future leader, not a successful executive. A frightened man realizing consequences had finally arrived. Then came the second blow. Another investigator approached Vivian. She accepted the paperwork with far more dignity. Yet I saw the moment her confidence broke. Her eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then the list of entities, the names, the transactions, the requests. She understood immediately. This wasn't rumor anymore. This wasn't social embarrassment. This wasn't a family dispute. The federal government had entered the story, and federal investigations don't disappear because someone hosts charity galas. Around us, phones continued recording. Guests continued whispering. The entire city would know by morning. Then Terrence did something nobody expected. He stood, slowly, quietly. For most of the evening, he had remained trapped between loyalty and reality, between his family and the evidence, between comfort and truth. Now he looked exhausted, older, defeated. He walked toward the stage while everyone watched. Vivian immediately turned toward him. Terrence. Her voice sounded almost desperate. Not now. He didn't stop walking. Terrence, she repeated. Listen to me. For years, he always listened. Tonight, he didn't. He stepped onto the stage and looked at the giant screen displaying the evidence. The transfers, the emails, the approvals, the timeline. Then he looked at me. For a moment, I saw the man I married, not the coward he became. The man he used to be before fear hollowed him out. The account was real? He asked quietly. I nodded. Yes. His eyes closed briefly. And the trust? Real. Another pause. And the pregnancy? That question hurt more than all the others, because after everything, part of him still needed to ask. She was always real, Terrence. Tears appeared in his eyes immediately. Not dramatic tears, not cinematic tears. The kind people cry when denial finally collapses beneath the weight of reality. Around the ballroom, nobody spoke. They watched a man discover that the people he trusted most had built his life around lies. Vivian stepped toward him. I was protecting you. Terrence laughed, a broken sound. No. He looked directly at her. You were protecting yourselves. The words hit harder than any evidence. Because they came from her own son, the son she spent years controlling, the son she expected to stand beside her forever. Across the room, Jamal looked away. Chloe sat motionless. Federal investigators continued speaking with attorneys. Board members were already discussing emergency governance actions. The empire wasn't collapsing tomorrow. It was collapsing right now, publicly, piece by piece. And as Terrence stared at the evidence surrounding him, I realized something important. The greatest punishment wasn't prison. It wasn't losing money. It wasn't losing power. The greatest punishment was forcing people to finally see the truth they spent years avoiding. Because once they saw it, they could never unsee it again. And for the first time in his life, Terrence Vaughn was looking directly at the truth. 9 months after the night Vivian Vaughn pushed me down a marble staircase, I stood in a quiet hospital room listening to my daughter cry for the first time. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Nothing else in the world came close. Not revenge. Not victory. Not money. Not public exposure. Just that tiny voice announcing her arrival after everything we had survived together. Tears filled my eyes as the nurse placed her gently into my arms. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, strong lungs, strong heartbeat. Strong enough to survive people who had spent months trying to erase her before she was even born. I looked down at her tiny face and realized something that surprised me. For the first time since the fall, I wasn't thinking about Vivin. I wasn't thinking about Jamal. I wasn't thinking about Chloe or Terrence or the investigation or the lawsuits or the money. I was simply thinking about my daughter and the life she deserved. The war was finally ending. 3 weeks later, the first major consequences became public. Federal investigators executed multiple search warrants connected to companies tied to Jamal's network. Several financial records were seized. Electronic devices were collected. Former employees began cooperating. Within days, local news stations started reporting details of the investigation. Every week brought another revelation. Hidden transfers, undisclosed entities, false reporting, manipulated records. The deeper investigators looked, the more they found. The system Jamal spent years building collapsed far faster than it had been created. Criminal schemes often look powerful until someone shines a light on them. Then they fall apart with remarkable speed. Jamal spent months insisting he had done nothing wrong. Then the evidence became impossible to deny. Eventually, he accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial. The man who once expected to inherit an empire left a federal courthouse facing years of consequences instead. His name disappeared from business magazines. Investors abandoned him. Former friends stopped answering calls. The future he believed belonged to him vanished piece by piece. Chloe's collapse happened differently. No courtroom drama, no handcuffs, no headlines. Her punishment was exposure. The socialist image she spent years constructing dissolved almost overnight. The charities quietly removed her from leadership positions. Invitations stopped arriving. Sponsors disappeared. People who once competed for her attention suddenly remembered other commitments. Debt problems she had hidden for years became impossible to manage without access to the money she expected Jamal to provide. The woman who built her identity around appearances discovered that appearances are fragile when truth enters the room. Vivin suffered the hardest fall of all. Not because her punishment was the largest, because it struck the place she valued most. Reputation. For decades, she controlled conversations, controlled narratives, controlled people. Then she lost the ability to control any of them. The board removed her from every meaningful leadership role. Trustees cut off her authority over family assets. Former allies publicly distanced themselves. The same social circles she once ruled now spoke about her in past tense. People rarely remember the exact moment power disappears. Yet everyone remembered the night it happened to Vivin Vaughn. She was never criminally charged. The evidence didn't support that outcome. But the court of public trust reached its own verdict. And that verdict was permanent. Terrence's punishment was quieter. He lost the thing he valued most without realizing it until it was gone. Me. For months after the gala, he tried to apologize. Letters, emails, messages through mutual friends. He admitted he had chosen comfort over courage. He admitted he ignored warning signs because believing the truth would have required him to challenge the people he loved. He admitted he failed me. Every word was sincere. That almost made it harder, because by then I finally understood something. Regret is not the same as repair. Some damage cannot be undone simply because someone feels sorry. One afternoon, 6 months after our daughter was born, we met in a park. Neutral ground. No lawyers. No reporters. No family members. Just 2 people sitting on opposite sides of a bench while our little girl laughed in a stroller between us. Terrence looked older than I remembered. Life had a way of doing that. She has your eyes, he said quietly. I smiled. She has your stubbornness. We watched her play for several moments. Then he finally asked the question he had been carrying for months. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? I considered the answer carefully. I already do. Relief flashed across his face. Then I continued. But forgiveness doesn't always mean a second chance. The relief disappeared. Not because I wanted to hurt him. Because it was the truth. Real consequences aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they look like spending the rest of your life understanding exactly what you lost. He nodded slowly. Tears filled his eyes. Yet for the first time, he didn't argue. He accepted it. That was growth. Late that afternoon, he kissed our daughter's forehead and walked away. Watching him leave felt strangely peaceful. Not because I hated him, because I didn't anymore. The anger was gone. The bitterness was gone. The need for revenge was gone. All that remained was acceptance. A year after the gala, the trust officially transferred into the structure originally envisioned by Terrence's grandfather. Independent auditors completed their review. Additional irregularities were uncovered. Missing assets were recovered. Governance reforms were implemented. Most importantly, the trust recognized its rightful beneficiary. My daughter, the child they called imaginary, the child they tried to erase. The child who exposed everything simply by existing. On the anniversary of the gala, the trustees held a small ceremony. Nothing extravagant. No reporters. No spectacle. Just family representatives, legal advisors, and community members who understood what the moment meant. One of the trustees stood and addressed the room. Then he looked at me. "Your daughter changed the future of this family." I looked down at the little girl sitting on my lap. She smiled and reached for my hand. Everyone laughed softly. The trustee smiled too. "Not because of the money," he continued, "because she forced the truth into the light." Years earlier, I would have cried hearing those words. Now, I simply smiled. Because I already knew. After the ceremony ended, I carried my daughter outside. The evening sun painted the sky gold above Atlanta. For a few moments, we stood together in silence. No investigations, no lies, no fear, no manipulation. Just possibility. My phone buzzed with a message from Kesha. "Dinner tonight? Bring the little troublemaker." I laughed and typed yes. Then I looked at my daughter again. She reached toward the sunset and smiled. In that moment, I finally understood the lesson hidden beneath everything that happened. Justice isn't revenge. Justice is truth, surviving long enough to be seen. They tried to take my child. They tried to take my voice. They tried to take my future. Instead, they lost their lies, their power, and the world they built around deception. My daughter got the life she deserved. I got the peace I thought I'd lost forever. And the people who believed they could bury the truth learned the same lesson every generation eventually learns. No matter how much power you have, no matter how much money you hide, no matter how carefully you construct a lie, the truth only needs one chance to stand up. And when it does, everything changes.